Good morning. So I wanted to take a little time this morning to respond to the video on Ernest Becker that I just watched on Matt's channel. And I really want to recommend the work of Ernest Becker. His master trilogy are the three later books in his work: the second edition of The Birth and Death of Meaning, the book Denial of Death, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and then his posthumously published Escape from Evil. Rather than talk in length about the books, I would rather talk a little bit about some of the ideas that I've done with his work in this forthcoming book called Sources of Significance. What could be a better fortune than knowing about the fact that you're going to die? It's what makes life itself meaningful. Life can become meaningful because we know about our own death. It's as if death is the context for life's events. It gives them a sense of exigency and urgency and propriety. Without awareness of one's death, I'm not sure that you would have a life or that it could be meaningful. There would be no frame to make it a totality that would take on the meaning that it does. Um, Try to think about it that because you're able to contemplate your own death, you're aware of and can see what your senses could never register. That's the radical possibility of no more possibilities at all. All right? And so it's really a great gift. One of the greatest gifts that you can have is the ability to know that you're going to die. Uh, Here would be a different way to think about it. If you didn't know that you were going to die, there'd really be little reason to do anything important or significant either today or in your life more generally. You could just always do it later. And even if you didn't think, oh, I'll just do it later, you wouldn't know that there wouldn't be that possibility. And so here we are. We're all dying and we're dying together. I think the critical question becomes, how do we respond to that fact? How do we manage it? How do we help people give meaning to their lives despite the fact of their deaths? How do we help people seek the most sane forms of meaning, the most rich forms of meaning, while avoiding impoverished forms, while still accepting death? I mean, I think this is the question. Um, Unfortunately, it seems as if many people they just hide from the fact of their own death, even though they perhaps consciously struggle with, am I really just an animal who's going to die? They may either subconsciously or by a kind of fiat just appeal to religious dogma, and they engage in an ongoing self-deception that says you don't die. That's just sort of what they assume. Now, on the other side of this, I think there's another very unfortunate consequence of the way some people respond to their own death fear, or the way that they respond to their own awareness of their death, is that they assume that vision will do the task of understanding our relationship to the larger world, and they assume a kind of atomistic individualism, a separation from everything else, and then they engage in some sort of competitive stab and grab, looking out for number one, whatever that means. I think some people they think that the object of life, assuming that you're going to die and you're aware of, that you're going to die, is to be the richest person in life, to be the most well-fed and be the most comfortable animal around. I think there are some people who start to understand the meaning of their death when they look down at their navel. When they look down at their navel, they see the incontrovertible proof of the fact that they're social in their being. We are organisms that have come into the world literally through other organisms of our own kind. You didn't come into the world, you've come out of it, and you've come out of it through another person. You're part of a great chain of being. And not just humanity, humans emerged out of whatever they evolved from. There is an ongoing connection of events that is somehow mystical. And I think when people start to recognize this, they start to move toward larger meaning horizons about how they connect to the larger world, and their death becomes again a kind of frame or a kind of orientation that helps them see how important it is to make contributions to the larger world. Now, some people their response to the fact of death is they try not to think about it, and they just seek satisfaction in taking care of their children. They have children, they raise them, and they see their children as the source of transcendence. Other people, they may engage in that, but they also may engage in uh, different kinds of isms. They get involved in religious organizations. They may get involved in national identities, senses of identification with larger geopolitical organizations. They may even think of themselves as members of the military state apparatus, and they can walk in goose step with one another, right? Here we start to see very problematically the way that people, when they reckon with their own death, they may flee from it by accomplishing a kind of meaning in their life that is a way of transcending their own mortality, but brings horror and violence to the world. And so I guess I'd like to conclude my discussion here by wrapping up, talking a little bit about the work of Kenneth Burke and how Kenneth Burke relates to Ernest Becker's work. As people take meaning in their lives from responding to the fact of their death, there are three broad forms that could be identified. Now, these aren't either or categories. I'm not trying to suggest that a person takes one of these three. It's more to look at each of our practices, each of these as outlining or characterizing various practices and habits and engagements that we can see in the world all around us. The first could be called the homicidal response. The homicidal response is a person who maybe hasn't come to terms yet with the fact of their own mortality. If they haven't really come to terms with their own connection with the larger world. They simply see themselves as a sack of skin and nothing more than a body. They don't see themselves as partly the air around them and partly the larger environment. Instead, they completely identify with the body that's visual and identified through vision, and from there they engage in a very rapacious, I guess again, a kind of stab and grab, looking out for their own, what they take to be self-interest, and they're even willing to kill others to serve their own self-interest. And this again is a very rapacious person, but this is a kind of homicidal reaction. One arguably could say that, again, this is a mode of interaction that characterizes a good portion of some of our practices and our actions. The second characteristic response to the fact of death awareness is what could be called a more sublimated response, which is the suicidal response. Now, the suicidal response is a person who recognizes that they are in fact open to wider identifications than just the body. They realize that they can participate in larger communities and in larger organizations and in larger meaning horizons, and they willingly take their lives as a place and moment to sacrifice for some greater mission or some greater cause. Unfortunately, such suicide bombings and such forms of self-sacrifice often result in terror to others, death toward others, and lots of harms that just look around you. You can see this one arising. This is largely among the religious people. Now, if the homicidal position is the most easily adopted by the atheistic position, and the suicidal position is oftentimes, depending upon the religion, but seems to be often aligned with the religious dogmatist and fanatic, I think the subtlest and most important form, the most useful and significant form that characterizes our response to death is what Burke would call mortification. Mortification is simply living a dying life. It's accepting the fact that we will die, but it's pursuing beauty and grace and goodness and doing nothing but goodwill toward others, even to the point that you willingly allow them to put you to death despite your attempt to do goodwill for them. This would be the view of, say, Socrates, or maybe even, I guess we could say, the historical Jesus, whether there was one or not. The myth of a person who willingly does no harm to others, brings good to others, and affirms life to such an extent that they can even affirm the utter injustice, which is being put to death for nothing more than trying to do good for others. Okay, I hope some of that makes sense.